West Florida, and beyond. After all, our story is your story. Visit Sam Galloway Ford today, 1800 Boy Scout Drive, Fort Myers.
Win a grand prize trip to Universal Orlando. Log on to foxfornow.com.
The following program is presented by the Diocese.
Spending cuts now take effect across the board. What will the impact be as Washington...
Commentary with JevaChefs.com. Live video, J-EFFS.com.
None of this is happening because of the choice that Republicans in Congress have made.
Should the president have done more?
I am not a dictator. I'm the president.
Any chance that the GOP will cave on more taxes?
There's no one in this town who's tried harder to come to an agreement with the president and to deal with our long-term spending problem. No one.
This morning, my exclusive interview with Speaker of the House, John Boehner, and the White House view from top economic advisor to the president, Gene Sperling, who also found himself in the middle of a feud with Washington Post reporter Bob Woodward. And later, insights and analysis from our roundtable, the politics of the budget showdown, and some other debates this week, the future of the Voting Rights Act, and whether working from home is still okay.
From NBC News in Washington, the world's longest-running television program, this is Meet the Press with David Gray.
And good Sunday morning. So sequester is in effect, but the impacts have yet to be felt. One thing is clear, frustration with Washington has never been higher, and both sides are still dug in on how to solve our debt crisis. More taxes versus more spending cuts. We have both sides of that debate this morning, starting with the man leading the Republicans in the House, Speaker John Boehner. At the 11th hour of the sequester Friday afternoon, he made a high-stakes visit to the White House to meet with President Obama. Moments after he returned to his office, I spoke with him exclusively about that meeting, what's next, and what's at stake in this debate.
Exclusively.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for taking the time.
David, good to be with you.
As we sit here Friday afternoon, you've emerged from a meeting at the White House. There is no deal. Take me inside the room. What happened?
We had a very nice, polite discussion. But I had asked the president and Senator Reid to come with a plan to replace the sequester. Listen, we've known about this for 16 months. And yet, even today, there's no plan from Senate Democrats or the White House to replace the sequester. And over the last 10 months, House Republicans have acted twice to replace the sequester. There are smarter ways to cut spending than these automatic across the board.
That's just not true. They've made it very clear, as the president just did, that he has a plan that he's put forward that involves entitlement cuts, that involves spending cuts, that you've made a choice, as have Republicans, to leave tax loopholes in place, and you'd rather have those and live with all these arbitrary
David, that's just nonsense. If he had a plan, why wouldn't Senate Democrats go ahead and pass it? The House has acted twice over the last 10 months to replace the sequester. If we're going to, the president got his tax hikes on January the 1st. If we're going to get rid of loopholes, let's lower rates and make the tax code fair for all Americans.
Well, let's just talk about that for a second, because this can get complicated, but it's an important point. If most Republican economists believe that tax loopholes is actually tax spending, it's actually spending in the tax code.
That's correct.
All right, so if you like defense spending, and that's going to be cut arbitrarily, you agree that this is stealth spending in the tax code, why not give on this? Why not allow some revenues to come from tax reform? You protect defense spending, and you unlock the key to getting the kind of entitlement cuts the president says he would give you if you would just give revenues on tax reform.
Listen, I've worked with the president for 2 years to try to come to an agreement. Unfortunately, we've not been able to do so.
Right, but why are you opposed to that formulation? Because you were for tax reform a couple of months ago.
I want tax reform. Republicans want tax reform. We want to bring rates down for all Americans so that we've got a fairer tax code. But to arbitrarily pull out a couple of tax expenditures and to say, well, we ought to use that to get rid of the sequester, listen, well, every American knows Washington has a spending problem. Every American in these tough economic times has to find a way to balance their budget. They've got to make choices. And they expect Washington to live within its means and to make choices as well. We know that we've got a structural deficit. The president's run up $5 trillion worth of debt in the last 5 years. We have another $1 trillion budget deficit this year. It's time for the president and Senate Democrats to get serious about the long-term spending problem that we have.
Again, and the president has laid this out. He is serious about tackling the long-term spending problem, including dealing with Medicare, but he said it here. There's an ironclad rule that Republicans have.
Wait,
No
what out?
new revenue.
The
And without
president-
that, there can be no deal.
David, the president got $650 billion of higher taxes on the American people on January the 1st. How much more does he want? One. When is the president going to address the spending side of this?
But Simpson and Bowles, who a lot of people around here think is really the paradigm, how to look
Looking
at
rather
long-term
anemic.
debt reduction, they wanted a lot more revenue. You always say, he got his revenues, end of topic, he got $600 billion. You yourself said, look, we got 99% of the Bush tax cuts extended. That's a pretty good deal. So you didn't have to give a lot for that. Only 18% of the Bush tax cuts were rescinded with that $600 billion
There were
deal.
no
And
spending
you've committed
cuts.
to, wait a second, but you've committed to more in the way of revenue just last December.
But the president and I never came to an agreement. He could have come to an agreement, but he didn't. He got his tax hikes. It's time to cut spending, and every American knows it.
But the president, is he not committed to spending? Does his deal that was still on the table not include over $900 billion in spending cuts over 10 years?
Well,
which
the
is about
president
what the
asked for
sequester is?
$1.3 trillion worth of increases in revenue, and only put up $850 billion worth of spending cuts. Everybody in Washington knows what the problem is, but nobody wants to address it.
I just want to,
Listen, I've been here for 22 years, and I've watched presidents from both parties, I've watched leaders from both parties kick this can down the road, kick it down the road, and kick it down the road. We're out of road to kick the can down. We've got a long-term spending problem that has to be addressed. I've spent the last 2+ years trying to bring this town to address this problem, and it is going to be addressed.
and there's going to be different points of view of that because obviously the president believes that he has done it and is addressing it. I want to try to pin you down on 2 points. You were just talking about tax reform. And your objection, it seems, to this formulation, which is allow some revenues to come from tax reform to unlock entitlement cuts, and then you get rid of the sequester. That you think that's sort of arbitrary, it's just a couple of deductions. Are you open down the line to using revenue derived from tax reform closing deductions to actually pay down the deficit?
I'm going to say it one more time. The president got his tax hikes on January the 1st. The issue here is spending. Spending is out of control. There are smarter ways to cut spending than the silly sequester that the president demanded. And so we need to address the long-term spending problem. But we can't cut our way to prosperity. We also have to have real economic growth. American families' wages aren't growing. They're being squeezed. And as a result, we've got to find a way through our tax code to promote more economic growth in our country. We can do this by closing loopholes, bringing the rates down for all Americans, making the tax code fairer. It will promote more
There's
economic
no
growth.
ironclad evidence that lowering marginal tax rates is going to lead to economic growth.
Oh, yes, there is. There's
Bill Clinton
mountains.
raised taxes,
There's
President Reagan
mountains.
raised taxes.
There's
the economy
mountains
performed
of
well.
evidence that if we bring tax rates down, that we will help spur economic growth in our country.
That hasn't been tried before.
Yeah, Ronald Reagan, 1981.
He also raised taxes.
And it worked very well.
But he raised taxes as well. It didn't hurt the economy, did it?
Listen, he lowered taxes twice, both in 1981 and again out of the 1986 tax reform. When they lowered rates for all Americans, we had this boom in economic growth. Why? Because we got rid of a lot of the silly deductions, brought the rates down, and it helped promote more economic growth in our country.
The president says, look, on the long-term spending issues on health care, and I've talked about this with you before, you'd like to raise the eligibility rate for Medicare recipients. That's something the president opposes. He is, however, willing to
Well, no, he was for it.
Right, he was for it and then he pulled back.
Before he was against it.
Right, okay, he
Yes.
pulled back.
Before he was
But
against
he's
it.
for means testing for wealthier Americans. He's got that on the table, according to the White House. And he's for what's called in this town chain CPI, which is basically a reduction in benefits over time. How is that not being serious about the long-term entitlement problem?
Well, then why haven't Senate Democrats passed the president's plan? The House has passed a plan twice over the last 10 months to replace the sequester. Senate Democrats have done nothing. It's time for them to vote. It's time for us to get back to regular order here in Congress, where the House passes a bill, the Senate passes a bill, and if we disagree, we go to conference to resolve those differences. I made this point at the White House today. It's time for us to do this via regular order. Later on this month, the House is going
'Cause he wanted
to
to.
move its budget. Senator Reid acknowledged that the Senate expects to move their budget
He
later
wanted to
on
go
this month.
around to the United
Hopefully out this
States and
process,
tell everybody.
we can go to conference with the
Out
Senate
of
and
its
maybe
own.
come to some agreement.
So what goes on in these meetings? I mean, you talk about a nice conversation, you keep talking about your relationship being pretty good with the president. It's hard for any of us to believe that, given how personal it seems, given how pointed the language seems to be, and that you're just at such a basic philosophical, ideological, practical disagreement. I mean, you've got Congress left town, both sides hate this deal, and yet it's going
We
forward.
had a very pleasant meeting, but it was also a very frank meeting. I made it clear to the president that he got $1 trillion worth of tax hikes in Obamacare. He got another $650 billion worth of tax hikes on January the 1st. You can't tax our way out of this problem. We've got to deal with the spending side, just like every American family has to.
You've used some tough language this week, and at one point this week, you directed your fire at the White House and at the Senate. And here's what you said.
We have moved a bill in the House twice. We should not have to move a third bill before the Senate gets off their ass and begins to do something.
What did you mean by that? And is that appropriate for the Speaker of the House to speak that way?
Listen, I speak English. And the fact is, the House has done its work. We have this sequester because the President demanded it, and because Senate Democrats have refused to act.
174 of your members in the House voted to support it at your urging. You both agreed to do this.
The President demanded it at the 11th hour in July of 2011, because he didn't want to be inconvenienced by having another vote on the debt limit before his reelection in 2012. And as a result, the agreement that Senator Reid and Senator McConnell and myself had that didn't have the sequester, he would not accept. So he demanded that we find a way so he could avoid a second debt limit vote before his reelection. That's where the sequester came from.
So you say that the House has twice passed a bill on this. The truth is, you passed a bill that you knew was never going to be accepted by Democrats. You target setting up exchanges under Obamacare. You target Dodd-Frank. You target Medicaid eligibility. Laden with poison pills that you say the Senate Democrats are doing now.
Most of the changes in our bill to replace the sequester came out of the president's own budget. Not all of them, but most of
The
the
stuff that
changes.
you put in there, you knew Democrats wouldn't support, and that's exactly what you say Senate Democrats are doing now, which is
Well,
putting
here's-
things that Republicans won't support.
David, here's the process. The House passes a bill, the Senate can pass a bill, and if we disagree, we go to conference and work it out.
So, Speaker, what happens now? What do you think the impact of all of this is? The president is saying there'll be a ripple effect in the economy, that there'll be a growth cut, there'll be a loss of 750,000 jobs. What's the impact?
Well, then why hasn't he acted?
Now, but I'm asking you, what is the impact? I know how you feel about why he hasn't acted.
Listen, this is not the smartest way to cut money. The smarter way would be to actually move a bill that deals with our long-term spending problem. You can't continue to spend money that you don't have.
But is this going to hurt the economy? Will it hurt economic recovery?
Listen, I don't know whether it's going to hurt the economy or not. I don't think anyone quite understands how the sequester is really going to work.
Is the president exaggerating when he and his cabinet lay out the consequences?
Well, if you look at the fact that they claimed all these air traffic controllers were going to be laid off, and then it was found out they really didn't have to. And then when Secretary of Education went out and claimed that all these teachers in one county in West Virginia were being laid off as a result of the sequester, found out that wasn't quite true. And then they release thousands of detainees down in Arizona before the sequester even takes effect. There are a lot of questions about how the White House is handling the communications.
You called
on
the
this.
sequester dangerous, and it would, quote, threaten U.S. national security. Were you exaggerating?
I am concerned about its impact on our economy and its impact on our military. Listen, we've known about this problem for 16 months. We've known the sequester was coming. That's why the House last year acted twice. Why didn't the Senate Democrats act? Where was the president's plan? Why didn't they pass something? And here we are at beyond the 11th hour, looking at each other without having acted.
Do you think Bob Woodward has exposed something about the White House positions on all this that we didn't know?
Well, I think he made clear that the sequester was the president's idea. It was the White House that demanded it. I think Bob Woodward was right.
The feeling is, you hear it publicly from the president, but also privately as well, that you can't agree, even if you'd like to, on any more revenue, because the House caucus, conservatives, Tea Party folks were so upset with you for the last revenue increase to avoid the fiscal cliff, that they in effect lead you, you don't lead them, that you don't have room to maneuver.
Well, David, let me just say this. There's not one member of our caucus who said one word to me that was critical of the fact that we'd lower taxes for 99.1% of the American people. Not one.
Are you secure in your speakership?
Listen, I'm here to lead the fight against out-of-control spending. And I'm going to lead that fight as Speaker of the House.
The next crisis potentially is what happens when you
You
fund
just
the
size him
government
up
for the
and
rest of the year. That's called the continuing
talk to
resolution.
me.
Are you committed to doing whatever it takes to keep the government open?
Absolutely. We at the House next week will act to extend the continuing resolution through the end of the fiscal year, September 30th. The President this morning agreed that we should not have any talk of a government shutdown. So I'm hopeful that the House and Senate will be able to work through this.
So what happens next? I mean, is the political outcry, does it cause so much political pain on one side or the other that one side gives? How does this get resolved?
I don't think anyone quite understands how it gets resolved. After we do our continuing resolution, we'll begin to work on our budget. The House has done a budget every year that I've been Speaker. The Senate hasn't done a budget for 4 years. They've committed to do a budget this year, and I hope that they do. And out of that discussion, out of that process, maybe we can find a way to deal with our long-term spending problem.
I'll ask you what my White House colleagues in the press corps there have asked the President. Do you bear any responsibility for a failure to find agreement?
There's no one in this town who's tried harder to come to an agreement with the President to deal with our long-term spending problem. No one. It's unfortunate, and we've not been able to come to an agreement. But the House did its work to avoid this sequester, to avoid these random and automatic spending cuts. The fact is the President and the Democrats have done nothing to pass a plan to avert this and to deal honestly with the spending problem the country has.
I want to ask you just a couple of quick items away from this fight, if I can. On gun control, you memorably stood up and applauded when the President recognized gun victims, including Gabby Giffords at the State of the Union. In the House, will they get a vote that the President said they need to get on all of the proposed gun control measures?
I've made clear if the Senate acts on gun control legislation, the House will consider it.
Are background checks the sweet spot here? Did you support those?
We've already had a number of hearings in the House. We're going to continue to have hearings. But David, we need to look at more than just guns. We need to look at violence in our society. We've got a violent society, and if you've looked at all these mass shootings, what you see is the people who perpetrated these crimes all had a history of mental illness. And so where's the nexus? And how do we ensure that we keep guns out of the hands of people who should not have them?
It was a poignant moment on Capitol Hill this week when Rosa Parks was honored with the statue here. And a heated debate about voting rights in the Supreme Court. Justice Scalia said the act now amounts to, quote, perpetuation of racial entitlement, and questioned whether it was the kind of question you can leave to Congress. You voted to reauthorize this in 2006. You called it an effective tool. Do you believe that the Voting Rights Act is still needed?
Well, I think the Voting Rights Act is passed with large majorities in the House and Senate. I think it's something that has served our country well. But there is an argument over a very small section of the Voting Rights Act, and that's what the court's going to consider.
You told the Wall Street Journal in January, in the middle of the fiscal cliff deal, I need this job like I need a hole in the head. Doesn't sound like you're particularly loving your work.
Listen, this is hard. I think the American people understand it's hard. If solving this spending problem were easy, somebody around here over the last 20 years would have done it. It's not easy. And there are big disagreements between the two parties in terms of how we address it. But it's an issue that has to be addressed. And I frankly made it my mission as Speaker to address this problem because it is the greatest threat to our country.
This is a high-stakes time. I asked you a bunch of tough questions. I appreciate you coming on and answering them, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Happy to do it.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And now to the White House view and the Director of the National Economic Council, Gene Sperling. Mr. Sperling, welcome.
Thank you.
Tough questions for the Speaker of the House, and now some tough questions for you about this whole fight. You're sitting there with a laminated copy of the President's principles, his plan, as I described when I questioned the Speaker of the House, what the President was for. But here's the problem.
Copy of the
Senate
President's
Democrats didn't
principles.
take that blueprint into their legislative fight. If this was the plan, why didn't Senate Democrats control, they control the Senate, President's party, why didn't they get it passed?
Well, actually, David, as you know, when you're trying to pass something in the United States Congress, you need to get 60 votes in the Senate. And you do need some bipartisan support. And look, I think what the President has said all along is that we're only going to get the kind of agreement that
We didn't try.
gets rid of this very harmful sequester, that takes away the threat of shutdown and defaults and all the things that are holding back economic growth and job creation in our country, if both sides are willing to compromise. Now, you're right. The President has a plan. This is a summary. It's on the White House website. But, the Speaker understands this. And what I think is most important to understand is that this really does reflect compromise. We've already cut the deficit by $2.5 trillion. $3 of spending cuts for every $1 of revenue. Now the President puts an offer to Speaker Boehner on the table in December. Even though the Speaker walked away from the negotiations, he's kept that offer on. And this offer has $2 in spending cuts for every dollar in revenue. But
But you knew, Mr. Sperling, you were not going to get new revenue. They signaled this repeatedly, and the President went out there to campaign, to try to raise the stakes and raise the public pressure, and it didn't work. Was it a miscalculation?
David, I have to disagree with you because we were in negotiations in December where the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, who you just interviewed, was willing to suggest, put on the table, $1 trillion in revenues for deficit reduction as long as it came from reform that focused on closing loopholes and deductions.
Right, but that
in
fiscal
exchange
cliff
for
deal,
that,
what ended up being was just a tax increase that came out of that. There was not balance, which is what the President says he's for now. There were no spending cuts. It was just revenue, and that's what the Speaker says.
So-
you got your revenue. Now, you were
All right.
going to
Don't let him collect the
obviously,
money.
the President wanted that balanced agreement. It was the Speaker who walked away. We wanted an agreement that included long-term entitlement reform. And we give the Speaker credit for the $600 billion. But I'll do a simple math equation here, David. If he put $1 trillion of revenue on the table 10 weeks ago, and $600 billion has been passed, if he was keeping his offer on the table, he would be at least willing to consider $400 billion more in revenues as a starting point from tax reform.
Why
if
didn't you
the
do it
President
through the
is
Congress?
keeping his offer on the table. And David, as you know, these are tough things the President agreed to. Means testing Medicare, that means higher premiums for well-off Medicare recipients, $400 billion over 10 years in Medicare savings, and the hardest of
But Mr.
all,
Sperling, I just think
the
it's important to
adjustment
point out.
of the consumer price
You
index.
say the President is for these things. I have no reason not to believe that's true. That's not what Senate Democrats put in their replacement legislation. So when it came to the legislative fight, because this is tough for Democrats,
Right.
they're not on board. So that's not the plan that he went to legislative battle with. He says he's for it, but that's not what the Senate could pass.
So I think we need to separate two different things. What the Senate put forward was a temporary replacement bill, just so that we could have more time to work on a longer agreement. You and I both know that the real answer to eliminating this harmful sequester for the next 10 years is exactly the type of balanced agreement that the President has called for, has still kept on the table, and that the Speaker Boehner was willing to consider just months ago.
Let me jump to this
Just
issue
weeks
of
ago.
impacts on the economy, to federal workers, to the military and other aspects of this. I'm not going to play this particular soundbite, but back a couple of weeks ago, the President was warning of the meat cleaver approach, that it's going to jeopardize our military readiness, that this was really going to hurt, people would lose their jobs. And then on Friday, he seemed to change his tone. This is what he said.
This is not going to be a apocalypse, I think, as some people have said. It's just dumb, and it's going to hurt.
So did the President exaggerate the case to try to win enough political pressure on Republicans that he didn't get in the end?
No, not at all. independent economists, from the chairman of the Federal Reserve to the independent Congressional
I've been
Budget
hearing
Office,
that for
have estimated
4
that this
years.
sequester is going to cost our economy 750,000 jobs. I talk to CEOs every day who tell me they have job-creating projects on hold because of this sequester and its uncertainty. I've talked to a major CEO who says he has 20,000 suppliers, small businesses, that will be deeply hurt. And we could go on about all the impact, but
Well, the impact includes what about teachers? Arnie Duncan, the Secretary of Education, said on Face the Nation last Sunday, there are literally teachers now who are getting pink slips, who are getting notices they can't come back this fall. And then some fact-checking came out that proved that wasn't the case. The Washington Post on Thursday reporting that sequester spin gets ahead of reality. When he was pressed in a White House briefing Wednesday to name an example, Duncan came up with one school district in West Virginia, and he acknowledged, whether it's all sequester related, I don't know. As it turns out, it isn't. Doesn't it hurt the White House's credibility, the president's own credibility, to make these claims and have them not turn out to be true?
David, I think we're having debate about what is the impact in this first couple days. Nobody ever suggested that this harmful sequester, which the Speaker himself said would be devastating to national security, was going to have all its impact in the first few days. It is a slow grind, but make no mistake about it. You can't cut $42 billion from defense in 7 months and not hurt jobs, veterans, and veterans are often those who work in the civilian military jobs. You're going to hurt a lot of people. You're going to hurt a lot of communities that rely on military spending. And yes, you are going to hurt education. You're going to hurt children getting mental health treatment. And my hope, David, our hope is that as more Republicans start to see this pain in their own districts, that they will choose bipartisan compromise over this absolutist position. And that's why, just yesterday, the president is on the phone calling both Democrat and Republican senators who he believes want to be part of a compromise.
After it's
Back in
done.
October, the president staked
After
out
it's too
very
late.
clear ground in the presidential debate against Mitt Romney. Here's what he said.
It'd be more like,
First of all, the sequester is not something that I proposed. It's something that Congress has proposed.
That's a
It will
lie.
not happen. The budget that we're talking about is not reducing our military spending. It's maintaining it.
As the White House has acknowledged, that's not accurate. The president did propose this. He didn't want it to become law, and Republicans supported it, but it was the White House's idea. He said there unequivocally, it will not happen, and yet it's happened.
David,
Is there some responsibility he bears for that?
David, Jonathan Chait, the New York Magazine, gave the following analogy. A mugger comes up to you and says, give me your wallet. You say, I don't have my wallet, but here's my watch. Well, technically, giving your watch was your idea, but it doesn't really tell the whole story. We know, everyone knows, that the president wanted an enforcement mechanism
come up
that
with
included
the,
revenues on the most
You're
well-off.
gonna tell me that
The
Republicans
Speaker
come up with
insisted, the
cutting-
Republicans insisted that
Go
this
away.
be an enforcement mechanism that be on all spending cuts.
You're not
Because we were
concerned.
forced to do that, it is true, we suggested going back to the Graham-Revin-Hollings mechanism.
That's not
on
what he
the
said in
whole.
that debate.
Well,
He said,
I think that,
I didn't propose it.
but I think it's most accurate that they did propose an all spending cut mechanism that would have this type of harmful impacts on defense and on education and research. And the idea, and this is the critical part, the idea was not that these would go into effect, but that people of good faith would come back and compromise. And we know that that is what's important. Republicans aren't getting a win by letting the sequester go into effect. They want more funding for border security. They say they want more funding for defense. The Speaker says he wants more on long-term entitlement reform. This gets nothing. What
Mr.
gets
Perlin,
long-term
was the
entitlement...
president right or wrong in that clip that I just showed you?
I think the president was overall right in that the idea of an across-the-board all spending cut was the idea of Republicans. But yes, we put forth the design of how to do that. But David,
Which was the sequester?
the right
Which
issue
was the
is,
sequester?
but the right answer is that we all did agree to this, and we all agreed
Part
to
of
it
it-
to force us to compromise on long-term entitlements and revenue
But that-
reform.
but that-
Exactly
so that
what
hasn't
Bowles
happened.
Simpson and others called for.
But that hasn't happened.
Well, why
And there's a
hasn't it
back and
happened,
forth,
David?
well, and I think you made your case about that. In the back and forth, you also found yourself in a feud with Bob Woodward this week of the Washington Post about just some of these issues. And part of that exchange, in an otherwise cordial email, included this. Here was an email from you to Bob Woodward that was released. In it, I do truly believe you should rethink your comment about saying that the president asking for revenues is moving the goalpost. I know you may not believe this, but as a friend, I think you will regret staking out that claim. When you said you will regret staking out that claim, what did you mean?
I meant that while the first issue of whose idea it was, the sequester, was one I disagreed with him on, but I could see how honorable people could disagree. I was trying to explain to him from a substantive point of view that the idea that the President of the United States was moving the goalposts by asking for the type of balance of tax reform that raised revenues, what the Speaker Boehner himself, as you noted, had called for, as well as long-term entitlement together to get rid of the sequester, was not only not moving the goalpost, that was the whole idea of the sequester. And I think that email was cordial, it was substantive, it was
But you
polite.
say you're going to regret it. I mean, does the president think that's a good idea to say to reporters if they challenge them that you're going to regret staking out that claim?
Well, David, I've had a 20-year relationship with Bob Woodward. It's been friendly, it's been cordial. Those emails are very substantive, they're cordial, they're friendly, and his reply to me...
Why do you think he's gone public with it and made an issue of it?
Well, David, I guess I'd ask people to look at his reply. His reply said, Gene, you don't need to apologize. He said he welcomed my advice. So I can't really explain it. All I can say, David, is I hope Bob and I can put this behind us because I think it takes away the focus.
Were you threatening him in any way?
Of course not.
Okay, Mr. Sperling, I'm going to leave it there. Lots more of this debate to come. I want to clarify one point. In the White House's view, there will not be a government shutdown in several weeks. This fight will extend now to a budget fight in the fall. Is that a fair thing to say?
What is fair is that if the Republicans stay with their part of the deal, meaning that they put forward a continuing resolution that's reasonable, not political, stays at the level we agreed to, which is $1.043 trillion.
My question, are you committed to not shutting down the government?
If they agree to that, which they've suggested they would, then the president doesn't believe in manufacturing another crisis, but we will still be committed to trying to find Republicans and Democrats that will work on a bipartisan compromise to eliminate, get rid of the sequester. And that's why the president was calling the leadership on Friday. That's why he spent the Saturday afternoon calling Republican and Democratic senators who he thinks could be part of a caucus of common sense to help move our country forward.
All right, we will leave it there. Gene Sperling, thank you very much.
Thanks, David.
And coming up here, what are the sequester cuts and all of their impacts, both real and politically? How does it get resolved? How do we get to a point where we can avoid these crises in the future? These kinds of financial crises. With me to break it all down, insights analysis from our roundtable, Congressman Raul Labrador, Kathleen Parker of the Washington Post, also Joanne Reed, Chuck Todd, and Tom Brokaw. Political roundtable coming up next.
This is Kevin. To prove to you that Aleve is the better choice for him, he's agreed to give it up.
That's today?
We'll be with him all day as he goes back to taking Tylenol.
I was okay, but after lunch my knee started to hurt again, and now I gotta take more pills. Yep. Another pill stop. Can I get my Aleve back yet? For my pain, I want my Aleve.
Look for the Easy Open Red Arthritis Cap.
I've always kept my eye on her, but with so much healthcare noise, I didn't always watch out for myself. With United Healthcare, I get personalized information and rewards for addressing my health risks. But she's still going to give me a heart attack.
That's health in numbers. United Healthcare.
You guys are good to go. Let me just get this out here. Unlike some places, we don't just change your oil. Our oil offer comes with a 4-tire rotation and a 27-point inspection. And everything looks great.
Actually, could you leave those in?
Sure. Want me to run them through the car wash for you too? No, I can't.
Chevy Certified Service. Get a 5-quart oil change, tire rotation, and a 27-point inspection for $29.95 or less after mail-in rebate.
Coming up, the politics behind the budget standoff. How do we prevent the ongoing cycle of fiscal crisis? Insights and analysis from our roundtable next.
I've seen incredible things, otherworldly things, but there are some things I've never seen before. This GE jet engine can understand 5,000 data samples per second, which is good for business, because planes use less fuel, spend less time on the ground, and more time in the air. Suddenly, faraway places don't seem so far away.
See life in the best light, outdoors or in.
Transitions lenses automatically filter just the right amount of light so you see everything the way it's meant to be seen, maybe even a little better. Visit your eye care professional today to ask about our newest lenses, Transitions Vantage and Transitions Extra Active lenses. Experience life well lit. Ask which Transitions Adaptive lens is best for you.
It's hard to imagine my life before her, or a day without her. So much of what I take for granted simply wouldn't exist. She is the force that holds our life together. She is my everything, the center of my universe, from Forevermark. The diamond, the promise. Find an authorized jeweler at forevermark.com.
You know what's impressive? A talking car. But I'll tell you what impresses me. A talking train. This GE locomotive can tell you exactly where it is, what it's carrying, while using less fuel. Delivering whatever the world needs, when it needs it. After all, what's the point of talking if you don't have something important to say?
We are back with our roundtable. There's the LA Daily News. Washington is totally broken. I think there's a lot of that feeling going around. Joining me now for the roundtable, Republican Congressman from Idaho, Raul Labrador, managing editor of thegrio.com and columnist for the Miami Herald, Joy Reid. First time on Meet the Press. Welcome here.
Thank you.
Our chief White House correspondent and political director, Chuck Todd, his 900th time in the press. Columnist for the Washington Post, Kathleen Parker, and NBC News special correspondent, Tom Brokaw. Welcome to all of you. Mr. Brokaw, what do you think of this fine mess Washington finds itself in once again?
Well, I really think that behind the headlines is the Washington Post this morning, and it says that Obama sees 2014 as key to his legacy. What we have going on here, 18 months out, on both sides positioning themselves, we're trying to retain control on the Republican side of the House and maybe even win the Senate. The president trying to build a legacy of some kind. There's a whole lot of politics to this, as there is in everything else. Kind of two villages clashing with each other who seem to occupy a separate universe. I think it's going to be okay in the short term, but once these cuts begin to take hold and people begin to respond to them, even those who believe in the idea of a smaller government, that's when the rubber will hit the road. Well, I just don't know when that's going to be.
Congressman, what do you say about that? I mean, you go home, do you worry that there's a cascading effect in these cuts, or do folks at home say, no, you did the right thing?
Well, most folks in Idaho are saying that we did the right things. You know, if you think about what families have had to do over the last 4 or 5 years, they've had to cut spending. We're talking about 2 cents of every dollar that's spent in Washington, D.C. had to be cut. We're borrowing between 35 cents and 42 cents every single year of every dollar, and we're worried about 2 cents of every dollar. I think we need to make sure that we do the right things, and the president already told you. In fact, the gentleman who was here before, he already told you that Republicans are going to feel the pain in their districts. That's what the president is going to try to do. He's going to try to make sure that the Republicans feel the pain in their districts. Instead of doing the responsible thing, we can find ways to cut in Washington, D.C. that are responsible, that are appropriate, that are not painful. But what the White House is going to make sure that we do is that we feel the pain, because they don't want to cut government spending. They want to increase taxes, and they want to increase spending.
Joy Reid, the president, in effect, tried that, and whether, I mean, the polling shows that it was successful. Our poll shows 52% think that it's a bad idea. But here was Tim Huelskamp from Kansas in the Washington Post on Tuesday, and this was his quote: "This will be the first significant Tea Party victory in that we got what we set out to do in changing Washington."
Yeah, and therein lies the dilemma, I think, for Republicans, right? They've built a lot of their brand, at this point, a significant share of their brand around cutting government spending. But you can't both take credit for the overall cutting of government and then try to get out of the blame if specific cuts hurt you in your district or if your constituents feel the pain of it. So Republicans are trying to balance what is a brand problem, which is that they are now the party of cutting spending, of austerity. But austerity is not popular. The polling shows that the American people would blame Republicans if the pain for austerity is felt by them. So Republicans have to find a way to sort of blame the president for the specifics, but take credit for the overall policy, and that's a challenging thing.
So what about the 2014? I mean, are we beyond thinking about this year, Kathleen? Is it about the midterm?
Well, apparently, it's in my newspaper, so it must be true. That's a very daunting task for the president. It's clearly his strategy to make the Republicans responsible for any fallout. But the Republicans are probably going to prevail in this because just traditionally, Republicans do better in the off years. There's higher turnout. So the president's trying to buck a historical trend. And I suspect, too, that what's happening with the sequester and the cuts, the results of which are yet to be seen, will play pretty well in the congressional districts he's aiming for.
And so is that the miscalculation here by the White House, Chuck?
Well, look, I think the miscalculation was they didn't understand, for some reason, that John Boehner, Mitch McConnell, and John Cornyn, okay, the top two leaders in the Senate, and John Boehner, they would.
It's exactly what
President Obama was asking them to do was, will you risk your political career? Will you lose your job in exchange for doing a deal with me that includes his taxes? Okay. Now the president never says, "Will you lose your job?" in the middle.
It would be
but
something fun to do.
They would have
if
lost
he was
their job. John Cornyn would lose a primary. Mitch McConnell would lose a primary. Any compromise that includes this, any new taxes on this is going to do that. What I found interesting about last week was everybody claiming that this was such a horrible thing, but the actions didn't meet the words. There was no serious effort to stop it. And you almost wonder if these politicians are secretly going to themselves, both some on the left who would say to you,
he signed the legislation.
Some on the right will sit there and say,
if the president didn't want to go through with the sequester, all he would have had to do is veto it.
But it's the only way government is spending.
He didn't veto it.
And I think it was a silent majority.
The president come up with the idea. The president wanted the sequester. The president signed the sequester into law. And the president's the one that went around and told all the people that it would affect that you're going to lose your jobs.
Over cutting spending. He actually had a deal with the president. And it was the president who moved the goalpost.
But he would have lost the speakership.
He wouldn't have lost.
You don't think so?
We actually increased taxes. I didn't vote for it, but we increased taxes at the end of the fiscal year.
That's not what John Boehner said to David Gregory.
But
it's interesting. He said, President got his taxes, and then later in the interview he goes, what do you mean, David? We lowered taxes on 99.1%.
We did lower taxes on 99% of the people, but the reality is that he was willing to go to the White House, he was willing to work with the White House, and he was willing to risk his job, knowing that many of us were not going to be happy, and the president continued to move the goalpost. And that's what Bob Woodward has been reporting. And finally, somebody in Washington, D.C. is telling the truth about what this president is doing. The president doesn't want a deal. The president wants a political victory. He wants a political victory on taxes. He wants a political victory on spending. And I'm afraid that he wants a political victory on immigration.
Tom Brokaw, you've known Bob Woodward a long time, and this issue came up as I asked Gene Sperling about. And here's how Woodward reacted to getting the email. He spoke on CNN this week.
I mean, it makes me very uncomfortable to have the White House telling reporters, you're going to regret doing something that you believe in, and even though we don't look at it that way, you do look at it that way.
You know, I told Gene Sperling that he should be offended that nobody believes that he's that threatening.
Well, I know Bob a long time, going back to his seminal days as the Watergate reporter. And I'm confident that White Houses have made him a lot more uncomfortable than that email over the course of the years when he's talked to him. Any reporter who's worked in this town has been yelled at by somebody in the White House or somebody on the Hill. It just comes with the territory. This is a speck that became a sandstorm overnight, unfortunately, and I think it's really reflective of the kind of media environment which we live now, in which everybody's looking to stir something up. When I was covering Watergate, there was a wise old bird who did commentary for the New Republic. His name was John Osborne. He was one of the great commentators of this town. He took me to lunch one day, and he'd had a blow-up for the White House the day before, and he looked at me and he said, you know, Brokaw, the problem is that journalists, all of us, we've got glass jaws. We throw punches. When somebody swings back, we go down with the first punch, screaming foul of some kind. I think that's what we have to keep in mind. And I'm reading Bob between the lines here in his last appearances. I think he does believe it kind of got out of his control at some point. We've got to move on. The country doesn't care about this. This is about an intramural fight in a high school cafeteria. It should be over now.
I don't know if that guy knows my wife, but she says the same thing about all of us. Joy, what about this lecture issue in terms of where this goes from here? A lot of some bobbing and weaving there from Gene Sperling about avoiding a government shutdown, but Boehner said that we're not going to shut down the government, so this is going to be a fight later on. Do liberals have to come to the idea that the president is willing to give up some stuff on Medicare at a certain point if he can get to that end game where he might be able to get some more revenues?
Well, obviously liberals are not happy with any idea that cuts Medicare, and it was interesting that the whole deal that came together, the Budget Control Act in 2011, left Medicare off the table. It's such a hot issue, and I think Republicans maybe have some regret that they didn't try to get that in there because this deal that was done did not include Medicare. That said, the president has put chain CPI on the table in the past. His base doesn't like it, but I don't see how you get to a compromise when Paul Ryan, who's the budget writer in the House, is coming back again to this idea of voucherizing Medicare. He's bringing that back again. And this was an idea that Republicans almost universally supported. They voted it through in the House. They paid for it to some extent with their constituents during the midterms. But, I think that bringing that idea back is such a non-starter that I can't imagine a compromise position between the White House, which is saying they want to protect Medicare recipients, and vouchers. I don't think that's going to fly with Democrats at all.
Kathleen, I've just got a few seconds before we get to a break. What's striking to me is that these issues are still so hard and that the election didn't seem to solve them completely enough.
Well, that's a statement rather than a question, so I'll just talk about something that I want to talk about, which is...
No, but is that true? Why didn't it?
Why didn't it? Because the Republicans cannot give on taxes. They simply can't. It would damage their brand permanently, and the president is unwilling to... He is insisting on raising revenues through taxes. There's no way to have a meeting of the minds and when those differences exist, and that's not going to change. The sequester is going to continue through the fiscal year. However, and I think it's very important to make this note, there is some flexibility in how the sequester cuts are applied, despite what's been said. Next week, or this week rather, the Congress is going to pass a bill, a defense appropriations bill, allowing the defense to have some flexibility in how they apply those cuts. And there's more to say on that, but it's not quite as extreme as it seems. And the Republicans, there's just no real reason for the Republicans to give at this point.
Let me get a break in here. We'll come back. Chuck will make a point, and more with our roundtable right here.
We know why we're here. To chart a greener path in the air and in our factories.
To find cleaner, more efficient ways to power flight.
And harness our technology for new energy solutions.
Around the globe, the people of Boeing are working together to build a better tomorrow.
That's why we're here.
2 years ago, the people of BP made a commitment to the goal, and every day since, we've worked hard to keep it. BP has paid over $23 billion to help people and businesses who were affected and to cover cleanup costs. Today, the beaches and Gulf are open for everyone to enjoy, and many areas are reporting the best tourism seasons in years. We've shared what we've learned with governments and across the industry so we can all produce energy more safely. I want you to know there's another commitment BP takes just as seriously, our commitment to America. BP supports nearly 250,000 jobs in communities across the country. We hired 3,000 people just last year. BP invests more in America than in any other country. In fact, over the last 5 years, no other energy company has invested more in the U.S. than BP. We're working to fuel America for generations to come. Today, our commitment to the Gulf and to America has never been stronger.
Where is the story called Your Life headed? Northern Trust's goals-driven investing can help you get to the next chapter, aligning your assets and risk preferences with each of your goals for a fully customized approach. With careful attention paid to the effects of taxes, expenses, and inflation. You have goals. We help make sure they're on the same page as your investments. Expertise matters. Find it at Northern Trust.
It's been off limits until now. Tomorrow, exclusive access to a remote corner of the world. Could change there have a real effect on terrorism around the globe? Go inside Pakistan. NBC Nightly News tomorrow.
In all of Naples, only one luxury golf course community offers 2 Tom Fazio designed golf courses and your own private beach club. And between the two, infinite possibilities. Mediterra. Have it all. Villas and estate homes from the 500s to over 7 million. Visit livemediterra.com.
Judge your next great performance for yourself. City Mattress, real savings every day.
Bill Smith, Southwest Florida's #1 destination for appliances and electronics.
Count on meteorologist Robert Van Winkle on NBC2 News.
This was Wednesday on the Capitol. This was a moment of actual bipartisan agreement. Rosa Parks honored with a statue on Capitol Hill. And it just came at a really interesting time this week with a debate in the Supreme Court about the future of the Voting Rights Act, what kind of society we want to be, and whether times have changed in our civil rights struggle. And Joy Reid, I wanted to ask you about part of that debate. Here was Justice Scalia saying something that got a lot of reaction about why he seemed to be suggesting Voting Rights Act is not still necessary. Portion of what he said.
I think it is attributable, very likely attributable to a phenomenon that is called perpetuation of racial entitlement. It's been written about. Whenever a society adopts racial entitlements, it is very difficult to get out of them through the normal political processes.
Again, the Voting Rights Act mandates states like Mississippi, Louisiana, others in the South and elsewhere to get federal permission if they're going to change the way people access voting. How did you react to that?
Well, first of all, it was a very antebellum phrase, so it was jarring just to hear it. He said it before. This is not the first time that Anthony Scalia has used the term racial entitlements. And I think one of the ironies in it is that his apparent objection to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is that it interrupts the sense of entitlement of political officials to interrupt the demographic tide and to shape the elections to sort of thwart it, right? Because what's happening here, and the reason Section 5 is still relevant, is that you do have politicians that are attempting to alter the process, whether it's cutting down early voting days, whether it's instituting voter ID. There was one instance that was argued during the court case about a municipality that literally stopped having elections because the demographic tide was turning against the white minority, emerging minority.